If commercial whaling based on science is completely denied, then Japan will be pressed to undertake a fundamental reassessment of its position as a member of the IWC.
海外からプレッシャーが非常に強かったんですね。クジラを食べるなっていうような、
命をいただくっていうことではやっぱり仕方ない、私たちが生きていく上の
我々はその十分な量じゃないと思ってますので、将来的にはもっと増やしてもらいたいと。
でも日本人はたくさん食べる気がありません。商業捕鯨を再開したらば誰が食べますか？
今でも外人の人なんか来るよ。車で来たらパトカーが後ろについてくる。
地元や警察から立ち退きを命じられながらも、
世の中のほとんどのスタンダードとかグローバリゼーションとか発信元は欧米です。
補助金がないと成り立たないですね。
They're the ones who have presided over this program to subsidize the whaling fleet.
This is what Japan says it will restart next July.
Japan says it will withdraw from the International Whaling Commission.
The first commercial whale hunt in more than 3 decades.
The ships will hunt up to 227 Minka, Sei, and Bride's whales.
ようやく捕鯨が再開できます。ありがとうございます。
In 2019, Japan resumed commercial whaling. Before this, it had conducted whaling for commercial purposes and sold the meat of the hunted whales on the open market. But this was all done under the guise of research, as commercial whaling is not allowed under the International Whaling Commission, or IWC, which Japan used to be a member of. The IWC is a UN-backed body made up of 70 countries, and it is responsible for overseeing global whaling practices.
The purpose of the IWC was to prevent the extinction of whales. The Japanese whaling industry had pushed whales to the brink. So nations of the world got together and say, hey, why don't we work together to prevent the extinction of whales?
Whaling, with the exception of whaling for research, was banned under a moratorium enacted by the IWC in 1986. And Japan tried many times to fight it, but it was constantly outnumbered by anti-whaling countries.
実は15年かけたんですから、その間に50回以上会合をやりました。で、私もそれにほぼ全部出たんですけれど、で、それが解決されようとしたときに、いろんなその監視取締りの措置に日本でもノルウェーが合意したときに、反欧米国の一部から、いや、この措置が完成しても捕鯨は認めないよって言い出したんですね。2018年に決めたわけではないです。
During his time as commissioner, Morishita tried repeatedly to reintroduce commercial whaling, but his proposals were always fought against by Western countries such as Australia, which denounced whaling as a wrongful act. In a 2018 meeting in Brazil, anti-whaling nations of the IWC signed the Florianopolis Declaration with a comfortable majority, a non-binding agreement that gave protection for global whale populations in perpetuity. Lethal research programs were also ruled unnecessary. And with its departure from the IWC, Japan can only whale within its exclusive economic zone, which extends up to 200 nautical miles off their coast. The zone also includes Japan's outlying islands. Much of the whale meat is caught by whalers operating at these ports and transported to major cities such as Osaka and Tokyo. And one of these ports is Taiji, a coastal whaling town which has become a target for environmental activist groups. Taiji is a small town in Wakayama Prefecture, only 6 square kilometers large and an aging population of less than 3,000. Its average age is at least 54, and its income comes mainly from the work of its fishermen who hunt regularly for seafood, including whales. On its brochure for tourists, it romanticizes the actions of the fishermen during their hunts and describes it as stirringly heroic.
昔からそういう食文化がありますんでね、クジラを取れるっていう食文化がありますんで、昔からここはクジラ取って まあ、子供の頃からやっぱりそういう食文化とかありまして、イルカとかクジラ、やっぱそれがメインですね。町全体をやっていく上で。
At the tip of the town is a whale museum that exists to chronicle the town's history of whaling. Exhibits similar to these paintings and photos are put on display, illustrating how the practice of whaling in Taiji has evolved since the 1600s. Another testament to the long-standing tradition are lookout sites along the coastlines of the town which were lit to signal successful hunts. Taiji's culture and much of Japan's is based on Shinto ideas that posit that man and animals are equally endowed with souls. Thus, when man consumes animals, for instance a whale, he becomes indebted and has to give thanks. For this reason, throughout the town, there are souvenirs, statues, and deities dedicated just to whales. But the town isn't infamous for its history of whaling, but rather another controversial practice.
今年アメリカとオーストラリアで公開された映画「ザ・コーブ」。地元や警察から立ち退きを命じられながらも立ち入り禁止。
In 2009, an Oscar-winning documentary called The Cove captured Taiji's annual dolphin drive, or slaughter as activists put it, at a cove not too far from the town's center. It drew international attention and has brought many foreign activists into the town.
この前にクジラのイカダがあるからそこへクジラ飼っとるんやけどそれを逃がしに来たりとかね、まあいろんなことしとるからだから今でも外人の人なんか来るよ。車で来たらパトカーが後ろについてくるわけ。
山の上に上がってきたんですけどもこのように立ち入り禁止の看板がありまして。
As a result of the controversy, a police box now sits across the site, and local police have conducted drills to prepare for anti-whaling protests. But outside of Taiji, outside of Wakayama, much of the Japanese population doesn't feel as strongly about whale meat.
クジラ肉は食べたことありますか？
ないです。
食べたことないです。小学校の頃給食で出されたりはしました。俺も同じく覚えてないです。
クジラ食べる世代が私たちの1個上なので、
そう
あまり私たち食べてない、ね。
若者には多分その食べる文化が浸透してないと思う。なんか写真とかありますか
In Tokyo's largest fish market, there are only 3 stores that sell whale meat, and outside each store hangs this diagram from the Japanese Whaling Association. Among them is Kujira no Tumisui, and at 10 a.m. it is the last store in the area to open. Whale figurines and signs decorate the exterior. Attached to a wall is a poster promoting a documentary that rebutted the code, and the same diagram from the Whaling Association. Whale meat here is sold in many forms. But this isn't even something Japanese people are keen on.
食べてる人はなんかみんなやはり日本人？一番多いのがアメリカ人。やはりなんか物好き。で次がオーストラリア人。でその次が中国。
食べている人たちはほんの一握りなので他の人たちはほとんど関心がないというふうに思います。クジラについてもそれからクジラ肉についても関心を持っている人は少ないです。
According to the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, Japan's consumption of whale meat peaked in 1947, when whale meat formed 46% of the Japanese diet. The closest was beef at 31%, and it was more widely consumed than chicken and pork as well, but soon afterwards it virtually vanished from consumption. Another survey revealed that 52.5% of the Japanese population is indifferent to whale meat disappearing from the market. Due to low demand, whale meat in Tokyo often goes unsold. Tuna still remains largely favored over. But coastal communities like Taiji continue whaling. Research from Jungo Sakama of Rikyo University found that in a 2012 auction, 3/4 of the whale meat catch was kept in storage and never sold. This portion of meat is stored for food security purposes, as claimed by the Japanese Whaling Association, despite whale meat not being a long-term storage staple.
クジラの肉がスーパーに並んでるかどうかも関心もないです、おそらく。で、日本人に対してクジラを食べるなと言っていることに怒ってる。反発を感じているから、捕鯨賛成と答えに、賛成ですか反対ですかと聞かれたらば賛成ですと答えます。
What's happening now is referred to as
anti-whaling.
Anti-whaling.
Which is the theory that Japan continues to whale because it resents being told to stop by the West. But the reality is, Japan's commercial whaling practices were introduced by the West itself. Whaling used to be done only in small coastal towns like Taiji, with unsophisticated tools such as bows and rowing boats, and teams of fishermen called Kujira Gumi, and only consumed by wealthy samurai warriors and merchants. But in 1897, the Norwegian style of whaling, involving the use of harpoons fired from a gun, was introduced, and a few local whaling companies used the new method to catch whales. None saw much success, and even as the industry expanded, it continued to only consist of several small companies because there was no markets for the meat. This continued until Toyo Whaling absorbed a large portion of the industry and became a conglomerate.
At 8:15 in the morning of August 6, Japanese time, the first atomic bomb hit an enemy target. At 10:58 the morning of August 9th, the bomb was exploded above the city, and in the towering mushroom, Japan could read its doom.
In Japan, the social reforms urged by MacArthur proved one of the most successful.
In 1945, Japan surrendered to the US, left it in a major food crisis. Under the orders of American General MacArthur, backed by the US government, the industry ramped up the scale of whaling to meet the shortage. Soon afterwards, whale meats became the cheapest alternative to other proteins, and the industry slowly grew with rising demand. Whaling then saw its peak, and an entire generation of Japanese people was introduced to whale meat. In 1951, after gaining independence from the US, Japan joined the IWC, a body which was founded to improve the welfare of both whales and the industry itself.
日本は第二次世界大戦が終わって、ある意味国際社会へ復帰するためのいろいろなステップを取ってる時期ですから、捕鯨だけじゃなしに漁業もそうだし、あらゆる活動についてその国際社会に一個一個、再び参加するということをやってた時代ですから、捕鯨の活動もそのうちの一つとして、国際社会の一員に復帰するための活動だったと思うんですね。
And from the 1950s to the 1960s, whale meat was virtually abundant. The amount on the market was comparable to that of pork, chicken, and beef, and whale meat was even consumed at school lunches. In the 60s, as many as 27,000 whales were taken each year. But in the 70s, the industry was hit by the rise of the West's environmental activism in the wake of declining whale populations. Anti-whaling countries began exerting pressure on Japan, both in the form of protests and legislation.
So Japanese who grew up during the 1950s, and they went to elementary school and they ate the school lunches, they have a certain nostalgia for the whale meat.
1970年代ぐらいから海外からプレッシャーが非常に強かったんですね。クジラを食べるなっていうような。それに対して日本の人たちは海外の人にそんなことを言われるのが良くないというふうに、自分たちのプライドを傷つけられることだと思ってきたので、それで、クジラを食べる権利は自分たちにあるもんだというふうに思っています。
At the same time, the country's meat and fish supply stabilized, and whale meat lost its popularity, but it remained in the spotlight. The attitude of the West was met with opposition from citizens in Taiji, as well as Japanese diplomats in the IWC. A tit-for-tat ensued between Japan and anti-whaling countries. The conflict flared in 1982 when a moratorium was imposed to curb the threat of whale extinction, with an expiration set for 1990. Its purpose was to reverse the damage of years of unrestrained whaling that caused populations to decline to dangerous levels. Research has shown that the moratorium is responsible for whale populations of certain species, such as the humpback, to repopulate to safer levels. But Japan at the time was unwilling to cave into pressure until the US threatened sanctions against them and forced it to sign the moratorium. Anti-whaling countries thought the legally binding effect of the moratorium would deter Japan's whaling activities, but they were wrong. Not long after the ban, Japan picked up its harpoon again, and whale catches have been steadily increasing since the late 1990s. Japan came under fire for making this decision. Consequently, its ships met heavy resistance from anti-whaling groups such as Greenpeace. As Western activists aggressively went after Japan for whaling, pro-whalers were quick to point out their double standards. Filmmaker Keiko Yagi was one of them. To rebut allegations made against Japanese whalers, she responded with her documentary titled Behind the Cove.
クジラ、命をいただくっていうことではやっぱり仕方ない、私たちが生きていく上のフードチェーンの上で必要なことなので、いただく。でもそれには感謝してっていうしかない。クジラのことを私がクジラの身で考えたら、ソナーテストとかオイルドリリング、油の掘削とかプラスチック問題、そっちの方が彼らたちを苦しめているので、一発バンって殺されるのと毎日ディスコみたいにガーってやられているソナーテストだとかオイルドリリングって、苦しみを味わえるのどっちが彼たちに幸せかって言われたら、今日はたまたま工事ですけどね。
Japan justified its whaling practices as part of a lethal research program, exploiting a benign legal loophole in the moratorium intended for scholars. And Japan became one of the only countries in the world that whaled on the basis of research.
For these reasons, the court unanimously finds that special permits granted by Japan do not fall within the provisions of Article 8, Paragraph 1 of the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling.
In 2014, the International Court of Justice ordered Japan to stop whaling in the Antarctic, saying that it had found no evidence of studies by Japan of the feasibility or practicability of its research methods.
国際司法裁判所 ICJ の日本側の主張でも、調査捕鯨から得られた英語のピアレビューの雑誌の論文は確か4本だというふうに、4本だけ4本だけなのに、近年だと毎年50億円使っていると。
オーストラリアの論点の一つはですね、昔 IWC はクジラを捕鯨を管理する機関だったかもしれないけれど、もう世の中変わったんだと、進化したと、国際機関は。したがって今はクジラを守る国際機関であるべきだっていう主張をしたんですね。で、実はインターナショナルコート・オブ・ジャスティスはその主張に対してはいやいや変わってないっていう判決を実は出してるんです。ところがやっぱりそういう部分はほとんど報道されないです。
In 2018, the Japanese delegation made one final attempt to bring back commercial whaling, but it was voted down 41 to 27 by the anti-whaling faction led by Australia and the US. Frustrated for not being able to get its way, Japan left the IWC in 2019.
捕鯨について来年4月から商業捕鯨を再開することとし、国際捕鯨取締条約から脱退することを決定しました。
今世の中のほとんどのスタンダードとかグローバリゼーションとか発信元は欧米です。で、アジアからの声、あるいはアフリカからの声、そこにはすごい多様性があるんだけど、なかなかそれがリーディングオピニオンになっていかないですよね。
This came at a heavy cost. Japan can only whale within its exclusive economic zone, a much smaller area compared to the seas and oceans it could access under its research program.
調査捕鯨をやめて EEZ の中だけでの捕鯨ということにしてしまうと、経営が商業的には成り立ちません。
And that is the story of how the whaling industry approached its end. Or so you would think.
のジャパンタイムズという雑誌で、多分インタビューされたと思うんですけれども、私たちは先祖の、努力を無駄にしたくないから、この捕鯨を続けていますと言ってたんですけど、そこを少しご説明お願いできますか？
もちろんそういうことですよね。ずっと脈々と受け継がれてきた、なりわい産業を我々の代では途絶えさせたくないと。
では今取っている頭数って足りていると思いますか？
いや、不十分だと思います。今日本が商業捕鯨で取っているクジラの量は2000トンに満たない。でこれは我々はその十分な量じゃないと思ってますので、将来的にはもっと増やしてもらいたいと。
The whaling industry is smaller than it was in the 60s, and now might be constricted even further, but it's far from dead. How then is it possible that whaling is still in business? The answer is interest groups, a small number of politicians and executives who have undertaken a mission the Japanese people themselves never cared much about, to revitalize the whaling industry which the West has been eager to quash. When the moratorium went into effect in 1982, the whaling industry decided to unify and work together. The Fisheries Association, a government-funded lobbying group, asked the Fisheries Agency to fund whaling activities to save the dying industry. And so the Fisheries Agency founded the Institute of Cetacean Research, or ICR, as a demonstration that whaling was going to be conducted solely for research. Government subsidies to the ICR have averaged almost $9.8 million annually. Meanwhile, Kyoto Senpaku, a newly established whaling conglomerate at the time, would receive funding from the ICR. It would serve as a ship charterer to only two clients, the ICR and the government, making it a private company wholly reliant on government help. In return, Kyoto Senpaku would fund the ICR via whale product sales. In fact, Kyoto Senpaku, the ICR, and the Japanese Whaling Association, which publishes a magazine on whales with the Fisheries Association, all have their offices in the same building, on the same floor. This is known as the Whaling Triangle. Likewise, high-ranking officials from the Fisheries Agency are transferred to work under the ICR, or the Fisheries Association, or private pro-whaling organizations. Some officials like Kazuo Yamamura have moved throughout the triangle. Yamamura previously occupied top positions in Kyoto Senpaku and the ICR, and was then promoted to become the president of the Whaling Association and a director of the Fisheries Association. 3 high-ranking board members of the Fisheries Association are also CEOs of companies that used to dominate the whaling industry in the 60s. These same companies are now the top shareholders of Kyoto Senpaku. This is a list of officials who have migrated like them. The triangle still stands today and retains powerful influence over government policies. Since 2005, prompted by the Fisheries Association, boards of education in multiple prefectures have been calling for whale meat to be put back on school menus. In 2011, the Fisheries Agency was able to divert $29 million from the country's disaster relief fund to support its whaling hunts. In fact, every year Japan invites the most number of delegates to IWC conferences, which ironically makes them the highest contributor to IWC funds. In 2018, they invited 50 delegates, while most countries typically just send 1 or 2. And among these delegates are representatives of whaling towns, individuals belonging to each point in the triangle, and members of the Conservative Party that has dominated politics since the 1950s, the Liberal Democrats. Since former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's tenure, the party has pandered to pro-whalers, promising to maintain Japan's whaling culture. And to ensure these promises are met, they have put pressure on the country's officials.
水産庁の中では捕鯨を管轄する部門は最も人気がないということでよく知られていますので、もう正直やめたいと思っているかもしれません。国内ではそうした議員に怒鳴られ、で IWC に行くと悪者として叩かれ、ちっともいいことがありませんので。
But even amidst the difficulty of being a whaling advocate, Shinzo Abe pressed on, perhaps following the footsteps of his father. And under his leadership, the party has never been more assertive on whaling. As a former leading member of the Liberal Democratic Party, Shinzo Abe's father, Shintaro Abe, helped establish the whaling conglomerate Nihon Kyoto Hoge, now known as Kyoto Senpaku. And just like his father, Abe made it clear that the Japanese government would continue to support the whaling industry.
我々の世代で商業捕鯨の火を絶やさず、未来に向けて継続する意義は大きいものと認識をしています。
This is unlikely to change under Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, who is expected to continue Abe's policies.
もしも脱退すれば、脱退したということで、自民党の議員は喜ぶでしょうし、そして喜びましたし、ナショナリスティックなプライドが満たされたので喜びましたし。
Nationalism in Japan along these lines is the sound of one hand clapping. That certain political leaders have made this an issue. They have taken on the international community.
できればずっと続けていってどんどん取れる量も増えていくようになったらいいなと思ってます。
Pro-whalers are wary of the opposition against them, but they press on. Only now, without the same guise.
They signed us up with a whaling crew for the icy Greenland ground. They said we'd take a shorter way while we was outward bound, brave boys, while we was outward bound. Oh, the lookout up in the barrel stood with a spyglass in his hand. There's a whale, there's a whale, there's a whale, he cried. And she blows at every stand, brave boys, and she blows at every stand. The captain stood on the quarter deck, the ice was in his eye. Overhaul, overhaul, let your davit tackles fall, and put your boats to sea, brave boys, and put your boats to sea. Well, the boats got down and the men aboard, and the whale was full in view. Resolve, resolve, let these whaler men know, to see where the whalefish flew, brave boys, to see where the whalefish flew. Well, a harpoon struck and the line ran out, and the whale gave a flutter with his tail. When he upset the boat, we lost a half a dozen men. No more Greenland for you, brave boys, no more Greenland for you. Bad news, the captain said, and it grieved his heart full sore. But the loser